Warning: the following story is not for the faint of heart. If you've ever feared the dark, feared being alone, or feared what you can't remember, this might be the story that haunts your nights. He woke up inside an abandoned building. One door. It led to the maze. This isn't just one of those generic, creepy stories. It's one of the true horror stories that claw at the corners of your sanity. As the man, a U.S. citizen from the outskirts of Bend, Oregon, ventures deeper into the shifting maze, fragments of repressed memories rise like shadows from the walls. He wasn't alone. He was never alone. Footsteps echoed behind him. A whisper brushed against his neck. "You came back, didn't you?" This tale is inspired by national park stories rooted in eerie disappearances from America's vast wilderness. Think true scary stories born from real park ranger experiences and unsolved mysteries. Will you dare follow him to the end? He stood still, the flickering light above his head, casting erratic shadows across the cracked floor. The air was heavy like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm charged with something unseen, but deeply felt. As his breath steadied, his eyes caught the graffiti etched into the decaying walls. "Welcome back, Adam." But who was Adam? He didn't remember his name. The hallway ahead of him split into 3 paths, each engulfed by darkness, yet each whispering in a different voice. A low growl to the left, a faint sob from the right, and straight ahead, silence. He picked silence. His boots echoed against the cold concrete as he walked deeper into the wilderness of memories, into this abandoned maze that felt like a prison, or perhaps a tomb. The deeper he went, the more the air shifted. It was no longer stale, but tinged with damp wood and earth, the unmistakable scent of the creepy outdoors. He was no longer in a building. Somehow the corridors had become trees. The cracked tiles turned into moss-covered roots. The cold walls melted into endless pine trunks, and when he turned around, the hallway was gone. There was only forest, a dark wilderness, a scary wood story come to life. Suddenly, a voice behind him, "Adam, you left me here." He spun around. No one. But the pine branches quivered, though the air was still. A single photograph lay at his feet. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, a blurred image of himself, younger in a National Park Ranger uniform. His arm around a woman, her face scratched out. The word traitor carved across her chest. His chest tightened. A cold sweat rolled down his back. Had he worked in one of those national park stories people whispered about? The ones where rangers disappear, where hikers hear footsteps behind them, though they're alone. Where the trees remember he couldn't recall. But something remembered him. A snap echoed through the trees. He wasn't alone. He ran blindly, breathlessly, ducking under branches, leaping over roots. The forest twisted around him like it was alive. Each step pulled him deeper into a place where true, scary stories and creepy stories weren't fiction, they were history. His history. He tripped over something hard, a half-buried radio. Old, rusted, still crackling. He picked it up. Station 43. This is Ranger. If you're hearing this, do not enter the West Trail. Something is wrong with the trees. They remember blood. The voice cut out with a high-pitched shriek. He dropped it. Then came the drums, low, distant, primitive. He followed the sound. He didn't want to, but his legs moved on their own. Through a clearing, he emerged into a massive stone circle, ancient tribal. Symbols carved into the stones glowed faintly. In the center, a totem made of bones and antlers, and wrapped around it were clothes. His clothes. Torn. Blood-stained. This wasn't just some creepy park ranger story whispered on Reddit. This wasn't fiction on a Let's Read YouTube channel. This was his life, his nightmare, his truth. A rustling, a hiss. He turned, and for the first time he saw them. Figures, human-shaped, but wrong. Their skin was barred, their eyes hollow, limbs twisted like broken branches. They moved like wind and fog, silent until it was too late. They didn't chase, they watched. You came back, one rasped. Another leaned forward, creaking like a dying tree. We kept your memories safe. Suddenly, Flash's true stories returned in fragments. A lost boy he'd found in the woods with eyes too old for his age. A call from a hiker about singing trees that echoed her name. A colleague vanished near Lake Hollow, last seen walking into fog, smiling. And then, fire. He had tried to burn it all. The circle, the forest, the memories. But the woods do not forget, and they do not forgive. He fell to his knees. The ground pulsed beneath him like a heartbeat. A voice filled his skull, not heard, but felt. Confess. He didn't know what they meant. Confess. More memories came not as flashes, but as floods. He had killed her, the woman in the photo, not with his hands, but by ignoring the warnings, sending her alone on a path he knew was dangerous, a path known in old ranger files simply as the Echo Trail, the path no one returned from, except him. But he didn't come back alone, did he? The forest trembled. Figures closed in. "Say it!" they hissed. "Say what you did!" He screamed. A sound not of guilt, but of horror, of true horror stories told in the dark, never written down, only whispered near campfires in creepy outdoor stories. He didn't remember killing her, but the forest did. The forest always remembers. Just as they reached out to him, everything blinked out. Darkness, silence, then a hospital room, beeping monitors, cold white lights. A nurse, Mr. Adam Everett, you're awake. You've been unconscious for 3 days. He blinked. Forest gone, maze gone, but on the windowsill a pine cone. Fresh, wet, and carved into it. See you soon. Adam sat upright in the hospital bed, heart still galloping despite the sterile silence around him. His hands trembled not because of weakness, but because of what he had seen or what had seen him. The nurse's voice had long faded. All he could hear now was the distant echo of the forest. Of them. He turned the pine cone over in his hand again. Fresh sap bled from its carved letters. See you soon. That night, sleep refused to come. When his eyes did close, he found himself back in the wilderness, walking barefoot through pine needles and brittle bones. The trees bent unnaturally, leaning inward like they were eavesdropping. In the dream, he passed an old sign half buried in moss. Welcome to Trinity Pines National Park, Esther to 1894. That name, Trinity Pines. It rang a bell, faint, fractured. Was this the place he couldn't remember? But read it would. When Adam was discharged, he didn't go home. Instead, he checked into a roadside motel on the edge of Oregon. Shabby curtains, a flickering TV that only played static. But it was enough to start digging. He pulled out his laptop, searched Trinity Pines National Park, missing people. The results flooded in. 1991, 2 hikers disappeared near Echo Trail. 2003, a park ranger named Daniel Ross vanished during a routine patrol. 2017, a woman reported voices in the trees and was later found catatonic. 2022, no confirmed entries logged on the west side of the forest rangers avoided. Each article fed into a growing unease, a pattern of creepy park ranger stories that had long been dismissed as folklore. But now to Adam, they read like true creepy stories, more real than the sterile brightness of the hospital just hours before. He needed confirmation. He logged into Reddit, the subreddit r/Let's Not Meet. He searched for Trinity Pines Echo Trail Ranger stories and finally, Adam Everett. Nothing. But in a thread titled Creepiest Outdoor Experiences in National Parks, he found something posted by u.whisperpine13. I worked as a seasonal ranger at Trinity Pines in 2006. West Trail was off limits, not officially, but unofficially, we all knew better. I once found an old ranger log buried in the archives entries from someone named A.E. Descriptions of how the woods talked back. One entry ended with, "They want me to remember." Never found that log again. Adam's breath caught in his throat. A.E., that was him. Wasn't it? He didn't remember writing any of this, but someone or something clearly remembered him. The next day, Adam drove toward Trinity Pines. He passed endless miles of evergreen wilderness. The road twisted and narrowed until it became a gravel path, then a dirt trail, then nothing. He stopped, got out, walked. The forest greeted him like an old enemy, familiar, cold, alive. Within 10 minutes, the path dissolved into chaos. Vines crawled up trees unnaturally fast, as if the ground itself was changing in real time. A wilderness story no park ranger would dare repeat, not without trembling hands. He reached what once might have been a ranger station. It was decrepit now, barely standing vines crawling through shattered windows. Inside, time had stopped. Maps curled from age. A single ranger hat still sat on a hook. He found the logbook. The cover was cracked leather. His initials etched on the back, A.E., page after page, written in his handwriting yet unknown to him. They called to me. Echo Trail isn't a trail, it's a memory, a wound. She's still out there, waiting, watching. I can't keep lying, not to myself. The final entry was smeared the ink, blurred by rain or tears. If I return, I don't return alone. Suddenly the floor creaked, not beneath him, but behind. Adam turned slowly. There in the doorway stood a woman, soaked in mud, hair tangled in pine needles. Her eyes were hollow but locked onto his. He knew that face, even with the blood dried on her cheeks. "Lena," he whispered, the woman from the photograph, the woman he had lost, the woman he had buried. "I told you not to let me go alone," she said, voice cold and echoing like a breeze through stone. "I didn't," he stammered. "You did." The walls of the cabin groaned as if they too remembered. Outside the sky dimmed, not night, just gone. No moon, no sun, only shadows. Lena stepped closer, but she didn't walk. She drifted like fog. She was no longer human, not quite. And Adam wasn't sure he was either. He fled the station, crashing through trees and branches. The outdoors closed in around him. Every shadow whispered his name. Every bird call sounded like laughter. He stumbled into a clearing of bones arranged in spiral patterns. Elk skulls, human femurs, old ranger badges embedded in the dirt. A signpost stood crooked in the center. Echo Trail. No entry. He stepped closer. New words were etched below. It scratched into the wood with what looked like fingernails. Return is betrayal. Stay is truth. He heard voices behind him, dozens, all familiar. Colleagues, friends, rangers, people he remembered, people who should have been dead. One of them stepped forward. A tall man in full ranger uniform, face split by a grotesque smile that never blinked. "Welcome back, Adam." His voice was inhuman, yet it shook something deep inside Adam's skull. "You made us forget, but we remember." A chorus followed. "We remember. We remember." And in that moment, Adam understood this wasn't just a place. It was a repository, a graveyard of memory. Every creepy ranger story, every scary story on Reddit, every true story told in whispers around the fire. They weren't just stories. They were recordings. The woods had always been listening, and now they were speaking. Adam tried to scream, but no sound came. Just pine needles in his throat. He ran again deeper into Echo Trail, the trail that wasn't mapped, the trail that no one returned from. Except now, he wasn't trying to return. He was trying to merge. The forest pulsed with life. Trees opened like lungs breathing around him. Shadows reached out with long-fingered limbs. He passed campsites, abandoned ranger outposts, swallowed by moss, and footprints walking beside him that weren't his. At last, he saw it. The stone circle again. Only this time, it wasn't ancient. It was new, built for him. In the center, a mirror, old, cracked. He looked into it, but the reflection wasn't his. It wore his face, and it smiled. The mirror didn't show Adam. Not really. The face staring back wore his features, the same cheekbones, the same scar above the brow, but the eyes weren't human. They were ancient, rooted, like they belonged to something that had grown from the soil, fed not by sunlight, but by secrets. The reflection tilted its head, mimicking him. Then it grinned wide-splitting skin, revealing a mouth filled not with teeth, but splinters and moss. Adam stumbled back. The forest didn't let him fall. The trees moved subtly, impossibly, catching him, setting him upright. He wasn't in a park ranger story anymore. He was one. A true creepy story in the making. Behind him, the wind carried whispers again. This time they were names, real names. Names he recognized from national park stories, tales of rangers gone missing, campers vanishing without a trace, hikers walking in circles for days until their minds shattered. Daniel Ross, Marcy Llewellyn, Travis Reed, Samantha Sammy Klein. All the faces he'd seen on bulletin boards. All the people the rangers at Trinity Pines whispered about but never investigated too hard. The forest didn't lose them. It took them, and it remembered. Adam turned in place, surrounded by the spiral of bones and branches again. The mirror cracked. Then it bled thick sap-like fluid running down its frame. He reached forward and touched it. The world tore open. He wasn't in the forest anymore. He was somewhere below it, a chamber, breathing, alive. The roots above pulsed like arteries. On the walls were carvings hieroglyphic-like depicting men in ranger hats kneeling before twisted trees, sacrifices, offerings, agreements. In the center, a pool of black water, still, reflective. He stepped closer. In it, he saw every moment he'd forgotten. Lena's last words, her last scream, the moment he'd heard it and turned away, the report he'd falsified, the trail he'd closed due to wildlife, the silence he'd kept, to keep his job, to keep peace. But nature doesn't forget. And the creepy outdoors stories people read online, the ones you find buried in Reddit threads or whispered on Let's Not Meet, they're not scary stories. They're confessions. A sound broke the trance, a bell. Distant at first, then closer. Clang, clang, clang. He turned. There, walking down a slope of twisted vines, came the rangers. Their uniforms were mold-covered, their badges tarnished, their eyes gone. "Welcome to the archive," said the first. "You remember now." Adam shook his head, backing away. "No," he whispered. "This isn't real. This is just some hallucination. A horror story in my head." The second ranger, her face half rotted, smiled sadly. All true horror stories start like that. "Why me?" he asked. They didn't answer with words. Instead, the pool began to ripple. It showed more true stories. Different places, different parts. A scary true story at Yosemite, another in Yellowstone, one by a frozen lake in Alaska. A young ranger hearing laughter inside his tent at midnight. A woman whose campfire refused to burn despite dry wood. A hiker who walked with a stranger for 3 hours before realizing the man had no shadow. Each one a puzzle piece, each one part of the pattern, each one connected. The rangers circled him. "You're the last one," said the woman, "the only one who left and forgot." Adam's chest tightened. "I didn't mean to, but you did," the others chanted. "You did." The chamber shook. From the ceiling of vines and bones, something descended. Not a monster, worse, a memory, living formless, vast, made of whispers and screams and stories too terrible to be written. It didn't approach. It enveloped. Adam couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only remember. Suddenly, a burst of light. He was back standing at the trailhead of Echo Trail, daylight blinking through leaves. Was it dawn? He looked down. His hands were stained red, his boots soaked. There was a man beside him, a tourist, wide-eyed, confused. "You pulled me out," the man said. I was stuck. Something kept whispering. I couldn't move. Adam didn't respond. He was trying to understand, had he just saved someone? Had he come back? But the air was wrong, too still, and his shadow was missing. Later, back at his truck, Adam found his phone in the glove box, dead though fully charged. He turned the radio on, nothing but static, until a voice pierced through. "If you're hearing this, stay off the West Trail. Trinity Pines isn't what it seems. They're watching, always watching." It was his voice from a recording, but he'd never said that, had he? He drove into town, stopped at the ranger station. It was abandoned, paperwork scattered, desks overturned, radios smashed, no sign of life. Only a map, a new one. All trails closed, except one. Echo Trail recommended for advanced hikers. He stared at the map and laughed. Not because it was funny, because he finally understood. This wasn't a creepy story he could tell friends. It wasn't a campfire joke or something to submit to stories from Reddit. It was a scary horror story that would never end. Not for him. Not for anyone who entered those woods. The forest had opened the archive, and Adam Everett, former ranger reluctant survivor, had become its newest librarian. A keeper of wilderness stories, a witness to true horror stories, a guardian of what should never be remembered, but always will be, because the woods never forget, and the Echo Trail, it always leads back. The wind howled across the open field near the forest's edge. Adam Everett stood at the hood of his truck, hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles whitened. Every fiber in him screamed to leave, to vanish, to disappear into some normal life, miles from any pine tree or national park. But normalcy was no longer an option. Not when your memories had roots. Not when you had become part of one of those creepy park ranger stories whispered among seasonal hires, filed in dusty folders marked unsolved and reposted endlessly on Reddit, always under the tag, "Don't go back." But he had gone back, and something had followed him out. That night, Adam checked into a small roadside motel far from Trinity Pines. The receptionist gave him a weird look, the kind reserved for men who look like they've been crying for hours. In his room, he drew the blinds shut and turned off all the lights. He sat at the edge of the bed and whispered, "Are you still there?" No reply, then a creak from the closet. He didn't move. It wasn't until 3:33 a.m. that he dared open it. Inside, nothing, except a bundle of old ranger reports tied with red string. He didn't put them there. They were written on yellowed paper, typewritten, stamped with seals from parks he'd never worked in, national park stories that had been lost, covered up, or left to rot in bureaucratic limbo. Yosemite, Shenandoah, Glacier, Grand Teton. He flipped through the first 1973. Ranger Campbell reported seeing figures walking uphill without ever descending. Reassigned. Disappeared 3 weeks later. Second, 1990. A camper near Echo Trail said a man walked into her tent without unzipping it. He left her a pine cone with her son's name carved into it. Her son had died in 1987. Third, 2009. A hiker posted to RR Let's Not Meet about a shadow that walked beside him for 2 nights straight. He never looked at it. He posted a final update, then went silent. Adam dropped the files. They weren't random. They were true creepy stories, real, tangible, cross-verified with stories from Reddit and old park ranger handbooks, all describing things that should not be real, but they were. He needed answers. Not just from books or ranger logs or forgotten posts buried in the creepy stories subreddit. He needed someone who had seen what he had seen. The next day, he drove to Ash Fork, Arizona home to an ex-ranger named Elias Mercer, who had famously quit the NPS after claiming the Grand Canyon spoke Latin at night. It sounded absurd. A hoax. But that was before Adam saw a mirror bleed, before he remembered Lena screaming inside a tree. Elias lived in a trailer parked beneath a rusted water tower. Adam knocked. No answer. He was about to leave when a voice croaked behind him. "You've got their smell." He turned. Elias stood barefoot on gravel, a shotgun slung over his shoulder, a crucifix tattooed over his left eye. "They don't let many out," the man said. Inside the trailer, Elias made tea with river stones and ash. Adam told him everything. The scary woods stories, the true horror stories hidden behind government files, the echo trail, the mirror, the chamber of roots, the pine cone. When Adam finished, Elias lit a cigarette and nodded once, slowly. "They're building something," Elias said. "Across parks, across decades. Every ranger who disappears is a nail. Every camper who walks into the woods and never walks out again, they're wood. It's a cathedral, a horror story made of human memory." Adam swallowed hard. "What do they want to be remembered?" Elias said. "That's what the forest is, a living archive of grief. The creepy outdoors stories you hear, they're entry points, just like you." Adam shook his head. "But why me?" Elias blew smoke toward the ceiling. "Because you forgot. And forgetting is unforgivable in places like these." That night, Adam camped near petrified forest. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. In the distance, he heard footsteps, not walking, pacing, back and forth, all night. He stayed in his tent, trembling, clutching a flare gun. At dawn, he unzipped the tent. A ring of park ranger badges had been arranged around his campsite, pointing inward, each one engraved with a name. All dead, all remembered. He began traveling, obsessively. He went from park to park, from Acadia to Zion, chasing stories, speaking to widows, reading handwritten ranger letters, searching forums, cross-referencing true stories that sounded too surreal to be real, until he found out they were. A forest where people hear their names whispered from the canopy. A canyon where all birds avoid. A hiking trail that loops back to the same spot no matter how far you walk. A fire watchtower where the radio only picks up crying. The scary true stories were everywhere. On blogs, on Let's Read, on R Creepy. They were warnings, invitations, sometimes bait. And the more he learned, the more he heard them. At first only at night, then during the day, then even in silence. Voices calling him back. He finally returned to Trinity Pines, not out of bravery, but because the wilderness had already followed him into every motel room, every mile of road, every crevice of sleep. There was nowhere left to go. This time he brought tools, GPS devices, satellite phones, night vision flare guns. None of it worked. He walked for hours, maybe days. At one point, he found a child's shoe stuck in the bark of a tree as though the tree had swallowed the rest. Then he found a mirror again, cracked, different angle. He looked. This time there were others behind him, hundreds, park rangers, campers, hikers, all of them. Standing behind him in the reflection faces, blank eyes hollow. He turned around. Nothing there. Turned back to the mirror. Still there. Then, they smiled. He ran, through the branches, over bones, into fog. He found the stone circle again. This time there were names carved into each rock. His name wasn't there, yet, but there was space, a sound behind him. Lena, or what was once Lena, no longer broken, now part of the forest, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "They'll let you live," she said, "but only if you keep them remembered." Adam fell to his knees. How she touched his forehead and whispered, "Right." The forest had given him a mission, not a choice. "Right," Lena whispered, or the thing that once was Lena. Her words echoed in Adam's ears, even as she vanished again into the trees, leaving only pine needles and silence behind. The sun never rose fully in Trinity Pines. The light remained dim, filtered through a ceiling of branches too thick, too alive. Adam had walked away from the stone circle, but never really left it. Something inside him shifted that day. He wasn't just a witness to a true horror story. He had become the echo keeper. When he returned to the world, the one paved with asphalt and GPS signals and endless scrolling on Reddit, he looked different. He felt different, but nobody noticed. That's the strange thing about real horror, about true scary stories that shape your bones and scar your memories. They leave no visible wounds. He got a small apartment in Flagstaff, Arizona. Remote quiet. Not too close to Trinity Pines, but not far enough to forget. He lived alone. No pets, no mirrors. Instead, he kept a desk, a large one, and on it stacks of spiral-bound notebooks, each one filled to the brim with creepy stories. Some were retellings of what he'd seen: the tree that bled when touched the mirror, that smiled back the field of ranger badges humming with memories. Others were stories he had heard whispered through his dreams, spoken by the wind that slipped through cracks in his walls. Stories about park rangers swallowed by rivers that never existed on maps. About hikers who walked into clouds and didn't come back down. About campers and wilderness stories who saw copies of themselves sleeping in their tents. He posted them anonymously to stories from Reddit. He uploaded them to r/creepy, r/let's not meet, and sometimes r/no sleep. They were always met with disbelief. Bro, this can't be real. You've got the best imagination on this sub. Where do you come up with this stuff? And always the same thing. This feels too real, like it could happen. He smiled when he saw those, because it had. But Adam wasn't just posting for entertainment. He was remembering for them. That's what Lena meant when she said the woods would let him live if he kept the stories alive. And he had a lot of stories to tell. Then one day it changed. He received a message in his inbox from Pine Watcher 88. Subject: we met once. Echo Trail. Body: you pulled me out. I saw you. I remember now. They're calling again. What do I do? Adam froze. It was the man he'd found wandering near the trailhead, the one who had said Adam had saved him. Adam hadn't thought he would remember. Most didn't. The forest let them forget. Usually, but not always. He replied with only one sentence: you right. That was the beginning of the next phase. Soon more messages came. From former rangers, hikers, even tourists. People who had survived barely and now felt the same calling, the same weight. A retired wildlife photographer from Montana sent Adam his own version of the creepy outdoor stories he'd hidden from the world for 30 years. A college student from Maine described being stalked by a deer that whispered in her father's voice. A backcountry camper from Utah shared a dream, one that Adam had also dreamed decades ago. It wasn't just his burden anymore. It was a network, a movement, an underground archive of true creepy stories. And Adam knew the woods were watching, but they were also waiting for what he didn't know. Then came the knock on his door. 3 sharp raps, middle of the night, no footsteps. He opened it. A boy maybe 12 stood there barefoot, shirtless, eyes wide. In his hands a ranger hat, rusted badge. Adam knew the badge. It belonged to Ranger Ross, vanished 20 years ago. The boy said nothing. He only pointed behind him. Adam looked out and saw nothing. No trees, no sky, only black. Pure, swallowing dark. He stepped outside. The world peeled. The apartment, the door, the hallway. Gone. He was in the stone circle again, but this time others were there, hundreds, maybe thousands, rangers, writers, campers, victims. And one by one they stepped forward and began to speak. They told scary stories. They told true stories. True horror stories passed down generations. Wilderness stories of animals speaking in children's voices. Outdoor stories about trails that moved and rivers that hummed. And as each one spoke, a branch sprouted from the ground, reaching toward the sky. The circle grew into a forest, not a real one. A memory forest, built of loss, guilt, truth. Adam understood now. He wasn't the echo keeper. He was just the first. The forest hadn't asked for obedience or sacrifice. It had asked to be remembered. And through him, through the countless souls who wrote, whispered, confessed, it was No longer just a place in a national park. It was now everywhere, in stories told around campfires, in comments buried deep on Reddit, in anonymous letters posted in ranger cabins from Yosemite to Zion. The Echo Trail was no longer a location. It was a story, a virus, a seed. Back in the physical world, whatever that meant now, Adam stopped writing. Not because he had nothing left to say, but because he wasn't alone anymore. The final entry he ever posted was brief. It appeared under a story tagged True Scary Stories. The title was simply, "They're Here," and it read, "If you feel them watching, if the trees bend toward you when there's no wind, if your dog won't enter the trailhead, you've already been chosen, right, while you still remember." Weeks later, hikers at Trinity Pines found a strange sight. Near the base of Echo Trail, where the signs used to read "Restricted," now stood a wooden kiosk. On it, a single book, leather-bound, titled The Archive. Inside, thousands of handwritten stories. Some were a single paragraph, others dozens of pages. None of them had names, except one. The first page scratched in shaky ink, Adam Everett, Ranger, Survivor, Witness. And carved into the wood above the book, barely visible under years of moss and age, "Let us not meet in fear, but in memory."